Venezuela, a nation with a once prosperous economy and stability, is currently facing a dramatic and turbulent journey defined by economic disaster. Over the years, several causes have fostered widespread poverty and social instability, causing Venezuela's economy to decline steadily. In this video, we'll discuss the geopolitical circumstances that made this country's economy vulnerable. Venezuela's economy before the crisis. Venezuela is a country on the northern coast of South America. Spanish colonization began when the Spanish exploited the country's mineral resources, like gold and agricultural produce. The 16th century led to the creation of the captaincy general of Venezuela, and in the 19th century, the country fought for independence to liberate itself from Spanish rule. Before the economic decline, Venezuela was considered one of the strongest economies in Southern America. So what went wrong? Internal and external factors led to the country's downfall.
Venezuela is facing a number of economic problems. Inflation is putting pressure on many businesses.
In the early 20th century, Venezuela's economy relied on agricultural exports like tobacco, coffee, and cocoa. And in 1914, the country discovered oil, but it did not start drilling oil commercially until 1917. The discovery of oil transformed the nation's economic landscape, and production of oil drastically increased in the 1920s. Oil became the commodity that drove Venezuela's economy. In early 2000, the rising oil prices brought substantial revenues, which allowed the government to fund different finance programs and infrastructure projects and increase access to education and healthcare. This was the peak of the Venezuelan economy. The shocking 50% decline in Venezuela's economy and its root causes. Around 2014, when oil prices started to fall, Venezuela's economy started to experience challenges. Now we will examine the major causes of Venezuela's economy's 50% fall. First, overdependence on oil was one of the key causes of Venezuela's economic collapse.
This in a country with some of the largest oil reserves in the world. But the price of oil slumped, and the government's management of the economy has been disastrous.
Since the economy relied too heavily on oil, it was subject to changes in the price of crude internationally. As oil prices kept falling, this harmed the economy. The country's political turmoil, which hampered policymaking, was the second factor. The lack of distinct economic reforms brought on by these instabilities made it difficult to conduct crucial reforms. Additionally, Venezuela had to cope with unsteady governance that created a risky business climate and deterred domestic and foreign investors from investing in the country's development. Money that could have been used for infrastructure, education, and economic diversification was diverted due to widespread corruption. This occurred while Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro's governments were in power. During their rule, policies favoring short-term political benefits were implemented, leading to economic instability. The country's agricultural output also decreased, which added to the economic problem because it made the nation dependent on imports for essentials, impacting the value of their native currency. International sanctions, which were frequently directed at members of the government and state-owned businesses, further cut off Venezuela from the rest of the world's economies and restricted its access to foreign financing. Additionally, currency mismanagement, which gave rise to a thriving black market for foreign currency, distorted the country's economy and made it difficult to obtain dollars in the official rate. This drained the economy even more by providing incentives for smuggling and corruption. Hyperinflation, unemployment, and a decline in the standard of living for its population are the final results of all this. The economy's indicators before the decline: GDP growth, employment rate, inflation, etc. Venezuela has experienced a significant decline in its economic indicators over the past decades. Let's look at the key factors that contributed to Venezuela's economic landscape, such as its GDP growth, employment rates, inflation, and other relevant factors. We all know that one of the central indicators of a nation's economic health is gross domestic product, GDP growth. Now, what does this mean? Gross domestic product, GDP, measures the national income or output of a country's economy. In the years before the decline, Venezuela once experienced periods of robust GDP growth. This incredible boost in the nation's GDP growth was due to its oil reserves. The country's economy exhibited an average annual growth rate of around 4 to 5% during this time. The oil sector significantly contributed to this growth, as Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves globally.
Venezuela is a major oil exporter. The nation's oil wealth paid for many social programs during the 14-year rule of former President Hugo Chavez.
What further boosted the economy's expansion was the high oil prices on the global market. Now let's talk about Venezuela's employment rates before the decline. The nation had relatively low unemployment rates, partially attributed to the labor-intensive oil industry. Job opportunities were also created in agriculture, manufacturing, and services. However, these surface figures lay under employment issues and a mismatch between skills and available positions. Inflation was also a concern even before the nation's decline, but it was manageable. The government's social spending and subsidies helped somewhat mitigate inflationary pressures. However, what spiked Venezuela's inflation level was the government's aggressive monetary policies, including excessive money printing fueled by hyperinflation and eroding purchasing power, which led to its socio-economic distress. Moreover, other economic indicators were also at a stable rate before the decline, such as infrastructures, poverty reduction, and particularly trade and exports. However, vulnerabilities stemming from mismanagement, overdependence on oil, and lack of diversification ultimately contributed to the challenges that led to the economic downturn. Events that triggered the economic crisis. Venezuela's economic crisis results from a complex interplay of events and factors that have unfolded over the years. The crisis has had profound social, political, and economic implications for the country and its people. Now, what do I mean? I'm talking about the escalating starvation, hyperinflation, crime, disease, and mortality rate, which resulted in immense immigration from the country. The economic crisis the country faced was seen as one of the worst in history and considered to be even more severe than that of the 2008-2009 hyperinflation in Zimbabwe or the 1985 through 1994 Brazilian economic crisis. One of the main events that triggered the crisis in Venezuela's economy was its oil dependence and price volatility. Venezuela's economy heavily relies on oil exports, which account for a significant portion of its GDP and government revenue. When oil prices were high, the country experienced economic growth and stability. However, the crash in oil prices in 2014 severely impacted government finances and led to a significant decline in revenue, sparking the initial phase of the crisis. But this was just the beginning. The crisis was further exacerbated by the government's mismanagement of resources and widespread corruption. For instance, the state-owned oil company, PDVSA, suffered from mismanagement and embezzlement, reducing production and revenue. Corruption at various levels of government also restricted effective policies and diverted resources away from critical sectors. Amid the crisis already brewing in the country, the government's bid to restore the failing economy resulted in printing more money, contributing to hyperinflation. The bolivar, Venezuela's currency, lost value rapidly, eroding people's purchasing power and skyrocketing prices for basic goods. The nation's over-reliance on oil exports left it vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil markets as the government failed to diversify the economy and invest in other sectors, leaving the country ill-prepared to weather economic shocks. Furthermore, this led to political unrest and instability, which also played a significant role in the economic crisis.
Has proof of multi-million-dollar corruption by Venezuela's top leadership, including President Nicolás Maduro.
Many facts will emerge, including proof of the reasons for our economic disaster, which is corruption. But for all that capital to be repatriated and for there to be justice, we will have to wait for the return of independent institutions and a healthy democracy.
Plus, repression of dissent and erosion of democratic institutions led to reduced investor confidence in a climate unfavorable to economic growth. In conclusion, the economic crisis in Venezuela is the result of a combination of factors, including over-reliance on oil exports, mismanagement, corruption, hyperinflation, political instability, and lack of diversification. Its currency's devaluation and inflation. The devaluation of Venezuela's currency, the bolivar, has greatly contributed to the country's economic crisis. The value of the nation's currency fell drastically against major currencies like the US dollar. The government's decision to fix the exchange rate artificially led to a wide gap between the official rate and the black market rate. This created an environment ripe for corruption, as people sought to exploit the difference to their advantage. As a result, businesses faced difficulty accessing foreign currency at a reasonable rate, hindering imports and hiking up the prices of essential goods. Inflation was one of the direct consequences of the currency's devaluation. This drove the country's huge population into poverty as they struggled to meet their daily needs. Let's look at some statistics. According to the National Living Conditions Survey, by 2021, 94.5% of the population lived in poverty. Even more depressing was that over 66.6% lived in extreme poverty. But this was not all. As inflation exceeded over 1,000,000% in 2018, this further pushed the country into hyperinflation. Prices of basic goods soared, rendering them unaffordable by many citizens. Food and medicine shortages became common, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis.
The front of the queue led to this. The loading bay of a supermarket, locked shut. There were no deliveries and no goods.
So the line stops here and then what?
It's a symbol of a system that's failing.
Scenes like this are playing out across the country as people swap rumours about what goods are available where, spending hours every day standing in line. So people have become almost obsessed by the shortages. And it's played extremely badly for the government here.
Hyperinflation also made it challenging for businesses to operate, leading to layoffs and closures. Government mismanagement and loss of foreign investments. When discussing economies that have faced decline, it's important to address the role of government and political elites mismanaging funds. When it comes to Venezuela, its story isn't any different. The mismanagement of funds by the Venezuelan government has significantly impacted the nation's economy and its capacity to attract international investments. With the country having one of the largest oil reserves in the world, Venezuela could have leveraged this resource for substantial revenue and foreign investments. However, the government's mishandling of the oil industry has caused decreased production, dwindling revenues, and a lack of funds for essential public services. The mismanagement extends beyond the oil sector, encompassing issues like a lack of respect for property rights and contracts further discourage foreign investment. The absence of transparency and accountability with public institutions has raised doubts about the safety of foreign investments, rendering the investment environment unsustainable. The subsequent drop in foreign investments has resulted in economic contraction, limiting growth prospects and job creation. The government's inability to attract international investments has also impeded technological progress and knowledge transfer, consequently restricting the nation's ability to diversify its economy. This series of events has pushed the country into a downward spiral. Impact on industries and society. The Venezuela economic crisis has also had a far-reaching impact on industries and society. One important sector that suffered from the crisis is the agriculture sector. The inflation made imported agricultural imports prohibitively expensive, reducing domestic production. Food scarcity became a pressing concern, and malnutrition rates went like a bat out of hell, impacting society's health and well-being. Secondly, the crisis impact on the healthcare sector, as there was a shortage of essential medicines, medical supplies, and equipment, leading to inadequate patient care and increased mortality rates. Many healthcare professionals immigrated in search of greener pastures, further heightening the shortage of skilled medical personnel. And guess what? The education sector was not left out, as it faced its challenges. With limited government funding, schools struggled to provide quality education. Teacher salaries lost value rapidly due to hyperinflation, leading to strikes and high dropout rates. The decline in educational standards threatens the country's future workforce and development. Measures taken by the government to rebuild the economy. The Venezuelan government has acknowledged the urgent necessity for economic recovery and stability reestablishment. Endeavors have been undertaken to boost various sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism. While addressing hyperinflation and currency stability, the government has implemented measures to tighten monetary policy, regulate money supply, and curb inflation. Additionally, targeted social programs have been implemented to alleviate poverty and enhance citizens' living standards. Reforms have been initiated to ease limitations on foreign investments, simplify bureaucratic procedures, and offer incentives for international collaboration. Improvements in transparency, governance, and efficiency within the national oil company, Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, have also been pursued. Collaborative efforts with international oil companies have been explored to augment production capacity and generate revenue. Venezuela's economic crisis has left an indelible mark on the country's industries, society, infrastructure, and the nation. As the nation approaches addressing the root causes of the crisis, implementing comprehensive reforms will be paramount to restore its stability. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. Check out our next video right here for more valuable information.